Hey everyone, and welcome back to the studio. Today, I want to demonstrate something fun and challenging: color gradients. Pairs like this one are a great way to practice those subtle shifts from one color to the next, and I'll walk you through how I do it. Let's go! We'll start off, as always, with a thin coat of medium on the panel. Gesso-primed surfaces like this one are very dry and will put up a resistance to your brushstrokes. To avoid scratchy, imprecise line work, I like to prep the surface with this thin coat of liquid medium. I'll begin my drawing stage by grabbing some burnt umber and some ivory black. I'll thin this mixture out with some medium so that it flows nicely off of the brush. From there, I'll begin my line drawing. I like to use straight-ish lines and angles to represent the organic shapes of this pear. This method helps give the object some nice, sturdy form compared to using wiggly, curved lines, which only make an object look lumpy and weak. As I'm drawing the line work, I'm paying attention to the information that I see in the reference. I'm not too concerned, however, with capturing every tiny little detail. I'm mostly interested in representing the most interesting parts of this pear. This isn't a commissioned portrait, after all. With the pear and its stem drawn, I'll ground it on the table surface with the cast shadow. I draw in the shape, then block it in with the same mixture of umber and black. I'm making sure that this paint isn't too thick by mixing in some medium. At this point, the drawing stage is done, so I'll begin mixing some shadow color. I really want to take my time with this. The shadow has a color gradient in it as well, but I start on the top right where it's red. I grab some cadmium red, bits of burnt sienna and burnt umber, and mix it directly into my pool of drawing color. This will give me a nice, warm, desaturated red. When I'm happy with the shadow value and temperature, I'll begin drawing in the shape of the shadow on the pear. Starting at the top, I use the same combination of straight lines and angles to show the gnarled, knobby form described by this shadow shape. I'll then block in with the color behind those lines. The shadow that I'm depicting here is the first piece of information that will give the pear its three-dimensional form. As the shadow works its way around and down the right side of the pear, you'll notice that the color begins to change. It goes from that nice, deep red to a desaturated orange, then eventually to a desaturated green. As it becomes more orange, I'll mix some cadmium orange into my existing red with some touches of ochre and a bit of burnt sienna to sap some of the saturation away. As the orange transitions to green, I'll add bits of lemon yellow, titanium yellow, and some of the cooler dark pigments like black to push it towards that color shift. The value also starts to brighten slightly as the reflected light bouncing off the table hits this left side of the pear in shadow. Keep it subtle though, this is still all on the shadow side. A touch of yellow ochre also helps this color from going too green too fast. I still want this to be pretty desaturated overall. Keeping track of the colors I've already mixed is very important when painting gradients. All of the pools of color are still on my palette and are right next to each other. I can adjust things, mix two pools together, and compare everything while I'm working. The reflected light is on the right side of the pear as well, but it's darker and slightly warmer because it's hitting the red part of the skin. More burnt sienna and a touch of cadmium orange will get that color pretty close. I'll brighten up the reflected light on the left side now. A few more touches of cadmium lemon and titanium yellow brighten up that desaturated green. There's an interesting wrinkle in the pear near the center of it. I'll block that in with a warmer, slightly lighter version of our shadow color and try to simplify that shadow shape as best I can. With the entire shadow side represented, I'll start working my way up into the midtones. I'll begin again on the red side, mixing some cadmium red, burnt sienna, and some touches of ivory black and alizarin into my shadow color. I want this to be one step brighter and one step more saturated than the shadow side. This starts to show the soft edge of the turning shadow. As the skin transitions from red to orange, I'll use the same techniques as I did before, slowly adding more cadmium orange into the existing mixture to show the color gradient. If the color gets too bright or saturated, I knock it back with burnt umber and burnt sienna. I'll continue working into the midtones by gradually lightening and increasing the saturation of the color. I try to approach these transitions as if they were gradual bands of increasing intensity. This simplifies the difficult task of rendering objects into easily quantifiable chunks of information and gives the painting some interesting brushwork. As I work up from the shadow into the light and towards the highlight, I'll gradually increase the brightness and saturation of the paint, comparing the new mixtures to the old. I work my way, as I have previously, into the transition from red to orange by using cadmium orange and burnt sienna. Same technique, get a little bit brighter, a little more saturated in steps. If you nail the value, this automatically begins to show three-dimensional form in the object that you're painting. An important note about brightening red paint: stay away from white. White will brighten the red, but will leach all of the saturation out of it, making a chalky, pasty pink instead of a rich, vibrant red. Instead, use cadmium orange. This will brighten the red without compromising the chroma or color saturation. The brightest red will switch to orange in these next steps. Again, avoid white in these mixtures. Brighten your reds with orange, then make the jump by using more orange than red. As the skin begins to transform into the greenish yellow that you see in the reference, I start adding some cadmium lemon into the mix. This brightens the orange, but starts to cool it down a bit and push it towards the eventual green. Again, as it gets more yellow, I simply start to add more cadmium lemon into the mixture as a whole. I start to tackle the left side, which transitions from a cooler green near the bottom to a warmer green/yellow at the top of the pear. I grab some cadmium lemon, raw umber, and black to start working my way up from the shadow on the bottom left side. I'll brighten this with lemon and darken it with umber and black. Again, trying to see this in bands of color and value. A lesson I've learned over the years is to avoid going too cool in these greens. Ivory black and lemon will make a green that feels a little fake, a little too green in certain situations. To avoid that, I'll lean more on raw umber and mix some ochre and a touch of cadmium orange into it to warm it up a bit. The brightest green-yellow will be around the highlights, so I'll use mostly cadmium lemon in those areas. This darkens and cools down slightly as the form wraps away around the left side, away from that highlight. The top of the pear is a bright, cheery, warm yellow, so I'll switch to a mixture of cadmium lemon and orange. The stem of the pear is casting a shadow behind it, so I'll darken my current mixture with some raw umber to block that in. I'll then soften the edges and paint the very bright topmost part of the pear around that stem. At this point, I'll move on to the background. I want a single neutral color here, so I mix some raw umber, black, ochre, titanium yellow, and a touch of white to get a nice mid-tone that's close to the existing value of the board. I'm mixing quite a bit of paint here. There's a lot more ground to cover. I condense this huge pool of paint into a more manageable pile with my palette knife, and then, using a larger brush, begin to block in the background, cutting around the shape of the pear. As I get this background in, I'll mention a few key notes. I'm using a scrubby old brush for this, which gets me some nice texture. I'm also making sure that this paint is pretty thin, so I have a decent amount of medium in there. If I feel I can't make the right brushstroke, I flip my panel over to make it easier to be precise up against the left side of the pear. I'm just making sure to keep things thin, get some interesting texture, and I'm trying not to leave too many razor-hard outer edges of the pear where it meets the background, at least on the shadow side. With the background in place, I'll paint the stem. This is a mixture of burnt umber, ochre, and burnt sienna to really warm it up, and touches of white and titanium yellow to lighten things into a highlight. This is essentially a cylinder, so it'll have a shadow side, a mid-tone, and a highlight. The turning shadow on the bottom left felt a little too sharp, so I'll soften that transition with some additional variations in value. I also work back into the brightest reflected light on the left side, making sure that a few key areas stand out, but then gently meld into the rest of the shadow. I then do the same on the right side, but again with the warmer version of that reflected light. I'll add in the highlights next. These are very bright, but I still don't want to use pure white paint. I'll mix some titanium yellow in there to keep it a little more natural. I also want to simplify the highlight that you see in the reference. I'll use it in a few key places instead of the giant blown out patch in the image. I'll keep some of the chunky brushwork intact, then soften the edges in certain areas. To further enhance both the form and the glossy surface of the pear, I'll mix a cool light with ivory black and white for the very left side. This is mostly stylistic, but the coolness helps turn the form. Just don't go too bright, you don't want it to compete with the highlight. I'm approaching the finish, so I'll just adjust a few edges, starting with that big wrinkle in the bottom center of the pear. It felt a little too crisp, so I'll soften that into its surroundings. I'll also work back into the transitions in the body of the pear, breaking up some of those defined bands of color and value to add some interest. A little more yellow breaking through into the orange, for example. The stem also felt a little lacking, so I render that just a little bit more. I push some of the color, define a few highlights, and I soften a few of the edges. The final step is to soften the crisp edges of the cast shadow on the table. I'll darken my background color a bit and bring that right up to the shadow using some careful, soft brush strokes. As one final step, I'll add some cadmium orange, lemon, and titanium yellow into my background color. This will show a bit of that pear color on the surface of the table directly in front of it. This implies that there's some light bouncing off of the pear, reflecting onto the surface. As we check out the brushwork up close, I just want to say that I hope this sheds some light on how I paint these color gradients. It takes some precision, but that just comes with practice. Thank you all for watching. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see me paint next, and I'll catch you all in the next one.